Welcome to Rambam in Depth. Today we're going to be discussing the Rambam's ruling in Hilchas Niski Mamin, Perek Yudalid, Halacha Tezvav. The Rambam is discussing the various torts, the things that a person does or doesn't do that causes damage, and his liability. So the Rambam rules as follows: Eisha avrav hezika sa'adam b'chavlobei harei hamaver chayiv ben nezakav ubishivtei ubiripuyei ubitzarei ubibashtei ki'ilu hizik biyadei. If a fire causes damage to a person, in other words, someone lights a fire and the fire spreads and burns a person, so the person who lit the fire is liable to pay for the damages, shiftei, the days that he's laid up in bed or in the hospital and he can't work. He has to pay for the doctor bills, he has to pay for the pain, he has to pay for the embarrassment. And the Rambam adds, Ki'ilu hazika biyad, as if he hurt him with his hands. So the Rambam continues, Sha'av pi she'eshem mamaynehu. Even though fire is your property, you lit the fire, it's your property, and we know that when you do something with your property to cause damage, you're liable for it. Your ox, if your ox gores someone, you're liable for it. However, when your property does damage, there's only one payment, the payment of the damage itself, the devaluation of whatever it is that was damaged. But in this case, you have to pay as if you actually harmed the person physically with your own hands, in which case you have to pay 5 payments: Nezek, Tsar, Ripoy, Shevis, and Boshes that we listed before. So why over here do you have to pay all these 5 things? So he says, Harahiu Kamesha Hizik B'Chetziav. It's like he caused damage with his arrows. When you talk about a person who causes damage to someone physically with his own body, it's not limited to actually taking something in his hand and harming the other person directly, but even by shooting an arrow, the arrow was his koach, his strength. It's as if he did it with his own hands, with his own bare hands. Actually, this is a dispute in the Gemara between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan says, Eisha mishum chitzav, that your liability for lighting a fire that causes damage is tantamount to shooting an arrow, because when you light the fire is naturally going to continue to burn until it reaches whatever it is that it causes damage to. And Rish Lakish says, no, it's mimono, it's only like your property that does damage, and therefore you only have one payment. That's the difference between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish, and the Rambam rules like Rabbi Yochanan. Now, the question is asked, the Mukha Yosef, one of the Rishonim, very famous question. He says, since we paskin, we rule, like Rabbi Yochanan, Eisha Mishum Chitzav, how are we allowed to light a fire before Shabbos? We light Shabbos licht, Shabbos candles. How could we light a fire? The fire continues burning into Shabbos. And if we say that a person's fire is like his power, that means while the fire is burning, he is connected to that fire. If we say Eisha Mishum Mimayne, fire is because it's your property doing damage, you're not doing it. But here it's as if you're doing it, as if you're burning that fire. And how are we allowed to light candles before Shabbos? And the Mukha Yosef answers, and the gist of it is that it's not considered as if while the fire is spreading, as if you are actually lighting that fire. But what it means is that when you light a fire, it's inevitable that that fire will spread. The liability for that fire begins at the moment that you lit it. It's as if it was completely burnt. In other words, whatever happens later with a fire, we consider it as if it had already happened at the time that you lit the fire. That's a famous question and answer of the Nemuka Yosef. And therefore, before Shabbos, you light the fire, there's no problem. The fact that you're liable for what happens later means that whatever happens later is considered as if you did it at the moment that you lit it. When you light it, it's before Shabbos. And commentaries ask a very interesting question. The Gemara in Tainis says that the Beis Hamikdash, although it was lit by the enemy on Tisha B'Av, most of it was burnt on the 10th of Av. And Rabbi Yochanan, remember, Rabbi Yochanan says that if he was there, he would have instituted the fast not on Tisha B'Av, but on the 10th of Av, because that's when most of the Beis Hamikdash burnt. And it makes sense that you would make the fast day on when the greatest amount of destruction occurred. So the question is asked by many commentators, that seems to contradict Rabbi Yochanan of Eisha Mishum Chitzav. Because if we take Eisha Mishum Chitzav the way the Nemuka Yosef takes it, that the second you light the fire that causes damage later on, it's considered as if the damage was caused at the moment that you lit the fire, that Rabbi Yochanan of all people should have been the one to insist that the fasting takes place on Tisha B'Av when they lit the fire. It's as if whatever happened on the 10th of Av already transpired on the 9th. So one of the answers given is that the Nemuka Yosef does not mean that when you light the fire that spreads later on and causes damage later, it's as if the damage was caused the moment you lit the fire. No, that's not what he's saying. What he's saying is the liability, the responsibility occurs the moment you lit the fire. That if I light a fire now and 15 minutes later it causes damage, when does the liability begin? The answer is it begins the moment I lit the fire, because that act will inevitably lead to the destruction of whatever it is that was in the path of the fire. But the actual burning, we don't say it's considered as if it burns at the time that you actually lit the fire. The Rebbe in Likutei Sichos Chelik Aleph gives another answer, and there are others who say the same thing, that the reason why the Nemuka Yosef maintains that the moment you light the fire, it's as if the damage had occurred, is because a human being cannot retract that which he began. When you shoot an arrow, once you shoot the arrow, it's inevitable. The arrow will go and fly and hit its target. The same thing over here. When you light a fire, the fire will, of its own accord, inevitably spread and cause damage. Therefore, the second you lit the fire, the liability begins, and it's as if you are already accomplished the damage that happens later, at the moment that you lit it. But when it comes to the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, and the reason that we mourn and grieve for it is because God was the one who allowed the Beis Hamikdash to be destroyed because of the sins of the Jewish people. If the people would have done tshuva, God could retract it. It's not inevitable. God could stop an arrow in its path. God could stop the fire from spreading. So there, Rabbi Yochanan was of the opinion we should have declared the fast day on the 10th of Av, because it is the time when the majority of the Beis Hamikdash was consumed. One could see from the Nemuka Yosef another interesting thing. It proves another point. There's a halacha that we're not allowed to tell a non-Jew to do work for us on Shabbos. And the question is, what is the basis for that? Rashi and the Alter Rebbe rules like that it's based on the principle of shlichus, that when you ask someone to do something for you, he becomes your shliach, your agent. So the Chazam Sofer and the Beis Meir maintain that that's not the reason. You can't say it's because of shlichus. Why is that? Because they say that on Shabbos, the prohibition is that you should not be involved in doing a malacha. Well, there's no malacha that's being done when someone else does it for you. So even though a shliach means it's as if you're doing it, so what? As long as you're not involved and actively involved, you didn't do malacha. In other words, they take the understanding of what is the prohibition of malacha on Shabbos is that the person should rest. The Alter Rebbe, and as I said before, based on a Rashi, holds no, it is because of shlichus, because the prohibition of malacha on Shabbos is not on the person's rest per se, but it's on the effects that he's changing something in the world. Rabbi Shlomo Yosef Zevin, one of the great authors of the past century, says from this Nemuka Yosef we can prove the Alter Rebbe's point and refute the Chasam Sofer and the Beis Meir. Because if we say that the malacha of Shabbos is contingent on the person's physical involvement in it, then what is the Nemuka Yosef's question from Shabbos? That Shabbos, you shouldn't be allowed to light a candle before because it's as if you actually are lighting the fire during Shabbos? So what? As long as you're not physically involved in it, there's no problem.